are live. Let's get our little show on the road. Welcome to Evolution Hour from Seattle over the Christmas holidays. The wee hours of the morning, December 23rd, 2024. Your time zone may vary. And of course, remember that cute little Tortugan WordPress.com. All the files available there are completely open access. All may be shared at one's discretion. So, as you can see, Shoji screen behind me, I'm with my niece and her family there for the Christmas holidays, but we are scheduling our little show as usual. Some delightful little stuff that'll be coming up. I've been trying to keep connected on the social media there. Jackson, my co-author, brought to my attention brand new paper that's popping up in Nature magazine, I think, on hello, Barbara. Good morning. The Cambrian and Precambrian period and the rise of metazoans, and that during the boring billion. That's a highly relevant little paper. So that's another one that we were chit-chatting back and forth on that we'll be incorporating it into the new book, which I would be pointing to my shoulder if I were back at the den. We're going to keep our technical literature and all the topical material as up-to-date as possible for our slide into volume 2 of The Rocks Were There. Anyway, this particular episode, of course, continuing our analysis of the creationist book Titans. We're slipping along through the last end of the marine organisms. I think we'll be bouncing into mosasaurs and that over the next weeks. And then, of course, this is one of our bi-weekly installments on the exciting world of the Casey Luskin Discovery Institute 800 plus papers that supposedly document junk DNA. And we'll be getting all to that little material as well. Now, remind everybody that all the links to the material and the full things won't be put in until I get back to Spokane in the early new year. So this and probably next episode will be kind of hanging in midair until we get around to getting all the material plugged into place. But bear with me, folks. You know, I'm just a lowly little drone operating here from the hinterlands. Anyway. The plesiosaurs are, we discussed a little bit of pliosaurs last time, which are the marine organisms, marine reptiles that have 4 flippers. And pliosaurs are the kind of short-necked forms, whereas you get the long classical Elasmosaurus Loch Ness Monster motif, plesiosaur. That's the topic of this little next section. Sarfatti and Tay are not exactly jumping off the gangplank regarding source material. They only invoke one little paper, Noah et al. 2017, which we're putting a link to that too when I get around to putting all the links in on there, on the practical dynamics of how pliosaur necks functioned, that they're kind of better at bending downward, which therefore was giving clues about the kind of feeding dynamics that they were doing during their life. Now, it should be reminded that absolutely none of this is coming from creationists. There's no discussion whatsoever of why a creationist model would be usable to explain why any organism looked the way it did or did what it did. It's all parasitical and secondary. And of course, there was no attempt whatsoever by Sarfatti and Tay to try to indicate what kinds were involved. They at least had listing of kinds, as clumsy as it was for the dinosaur branch, but when they're moving into these other organisms, they're just kind of leaving it aside. And I think in part because they're adrift, because marine creatures weren't aboard the ark, and therefore there's no baraminology on it, and therefore there's nothing for them to copy. So they're screwed. But that doesn't mean the regular scientists haven't been a little busy. So there's a 2006 paper from Dalla Vecchia on the little critter called Bobosaurus, which is a transitional early plesiosaur, and then a couple papers on their systematics and evolution that's more recent than that. Wintrick et al. 2017 and Sander 2023. So that's pretty recent material. And you'll be able to compare all the little fun and games and ins and outs of all of that stuff. Which now brings us to our little part 2, which is the ongoing phenomenon of the Luskin files. You remember quite early on, we encountered one paper which, if read very loosely, might theoretically support the idea that a lot of junk DNA was functional. And that was from like a decade or more ago. But in fact, when you start looking at the fiddly bit details, other than the fact of the known phenomenon that roughly a couple percentage of the various junk DNA forms and retrotransposons and all the rest look like they actually kind of do something, not always in a positive way. And in some cases, it's just that it's like foam on the beer. It's related to epigenetics that are just part of the things, because those little things like ALUs, for example, have a really there's a whole systems that have developed that can trigger and connect up with those, so they can effectively monitor and pay attention to what's going on at the molecular level, because of the fact that you've got all these little ALUs in there that are easy to spot. But they can also occasionally mutate and cause diseases. None of the material that Luskin's bringing up on this has triggers that theodicy issue. 2 weeks from now, it's going to be a different matter, but we're mild on this one. It all relates to more ALU stuff. There's a 2022 paper by Castellat, which is on epigenetics. There's Dilolobe and Cuquelon et al. 2022 on RNA polymerases and how those dynamics work. And D'Souza et al. 2022 on ALU inverted repeats, which are the little things that they're in backwards, and a bunch of those. So they're all basically characterizations of something that was already laid out. There's no new mechanisms involved in terms of delineating just how many ALUs are involved. They're looking at things that have already been identified in other contexts, and they're elucidating more and more about the mechanisms of how they go about doing what they do. So it's not helping the junk DNA is super duper functional case that was the reason why our little gang at the Discovery Institute have been citing all of these things. This is episode 17 of this thing that we're going through. We're about 10% of the way through their list. They say 800 plus. I don't know. We'll find out exactly how many when we get all the little fiddly bits out of the way. But so far, it's continuing the process of not adding any direct indication that numbers that are like 50% or higher of a block of retrotransposons or short repeating elements or any of these other things are doing anything at all. And therefore, none of it is contradicting Dan Stern-Cardinale's point, and reinforced by Zach Hancock and others in various discussions that they have done, that only a small percentage of the air quotes junk DNA is actually kind of doing something in certain contexts and not necessarily beneficial. It's interesting that Dan had a discussion. I haven't had a chance to see the whole thing yet, but there was a lot of buzz going on in our background discussion on the internet there that I'm accessing on my little smartphone whilst on vacation. He had a discussion with this biologist, Carissa, I haven't noted down her last name, and Dan, and this Sal Cordova, who is formerly old Earth creationist, mutated into intelligent design, mutated into young Earth creationist guy. And apparently, Carissa is kind of on the squishy intelligent design, anti-evolution end of things. And both of them were having a discussion then with Dan Stern-Cardinale on biology matters. And it was quite a long one. I think it runs for like 2 hours that I'll be able to look at. But anyway, there was a lot of background commentary going on with Dan and others basically going, whoa, it'll be intriguing to see what topics come up in details and all of that we'll be working on. Then there's all of the sidebar material. I've got a cute little stack of stuff that's potentially intrudable into volume 2 in relation to a lot of this current material. We'll probably have an info box that kind of brings things up to speed on some of the latest origins of life issues about what biochemistry is going on and what material is known from the interstellar medium and what amino acids can be brought to Earth and doing things in wet-dry cycles and all that. There's been a churning amount of papers since we did the last book that bear upon this little subject matter. And so we'll want to have that put up logically so that people will be up to speed on that end of it. Then, of course, the ongoing spurt of creationist material. CMI is verbose and upfront on having relatively easily accessible material. I'm on their little mailing list, so I get emails every week announcing the kinds of stuff they think are important, which are often referring to articles that they put up in Creation Magazine, including the various stuff that they have for kids, and repeating a lot of the same tropes that are going on. So we'll be including all of that material in so that we'll be as up-to-date as possible on that. Institute for Creation Research, of course, has Acts and Facts. They don't really have much in the way of like technical journals. The Answers in Genesis at least has that. Journal of Creation is kind of an Answers in Genesis operation, and then again the Answers Research Journal. And there's a certain amount of cross-fertilization from people in these various camps that you pop up with. And then the old hoary Creation Science Quarterly, and then, of course, the various creation conferences that they have. We've been trying to keep up to date to have all of that material there. Once I get back to Spokane, I'll be diving in with a vengeance to do my part on the big cosmology chapter, which will be talking about, holy smokes, everything, including the thermodynamic issue that was a bit that was a really big deal for creationists 40 years ago or so, and is kind of mutated onto a kind of sidebar. And then the material about the creationist objections to Big Bang cosmology and galaxy formation and planetary formation and elements in stars. I mean, there's a whole slew of stuff. And it's kind of fun to see the relatively small number of players you've got in here, Russell Humphreys and Jason Lyle, and there's a cadre, you really could practically count them off on one hand, who are the kind of cosmological players, most of whom have physics degrees and astronomy material, but aren't notably effective in regular publications. There's just a handful of people that are still kind of doing science papers that are published in the regular technical literature, not directly pushing the creationist model, but nonetheless, at least it gets something on their resume. But an awful lot of them are basically just writing articles for the creationist journals, reinforcing the various points. So, and we'll be dealing with the current up-to-date material. The James Webb Telescope is one of the big new topic fields that's been coming on, and creationists have been trawling supposed discoveries of how these are disconfirming the standard cosmology. Yeah, not quite. The most you can say is that we're learning just how relatively rapid star formation was in the very early universe, and by which the James Webb, of course, is looking in the infrared, so it's looking in a window that's like about 600 million years after the Big Bang, which is not exactly small potatoes, but still quite immediate. Theoretically, you'd have to move even farther into the redshift to be able to discern what's going on hundreds of millions of years earlier than that, and presumably, if we continue with space program and a civilization that can do such things, we'll work out a lot of those aspects. But the papers that are coming out in this area, and it's really quite interesting science stuff, and it also relates to the ongoing debate about whether or not there's dark matter and what its constituent is and what's going on with that, and dark energy, which is relating to the expansion of the universe and how fast the expansion is and has it varied and all of that. And so what you find with creationist apologetics is they're latching on to every little ups and downs and quibbles, but they're tending not to get too close to the actual technical literature. And then, of course, on the full-out creationist side, it's a bunch of ad hoc material, which usually is not really related so much to account for the cosmological data, because as you can know from, you can theoretically view the universe from a geocentric point of view if you feel like it. You're not going to be able to work out much useful physics that way, but you can proceed in that mode. You find the same kind of thing where they're really kind of focusing in on trying to apply cosmological principles to get around the issues of how come the universe is so big if it's only 6,000 years old, and how can we see any of it? And so there's a ad hoc material that's occurring in the fringe about having a kind of the rest of the universe expanding while everything around here doesn't. and so time is traveling differently between the two. But of course, that begs a lot of questions as to when the thing got kicked in. Whether or not any of those little fringe ideas are going to percolate up to the Jason Lyle level, and that crowd will find out. But there's been an awful lot of goalpost moving over the years in relation to all the cosmological material. I don't anticipate that changing as we get ever more material in play, and it'll be fun because we're at a stage now where we have an awful lot clearer idea of what's going on in the early solar system. We realize, for example, that a thing that wasn't a thing when I was growing up, which is the idea that a lot of the planets have moved in from the positions that they were a long time ago. So Mercury wasn't always as close to the sun in current modeling. Jupiter was originally farther out and was moving in, and was basically chewing up the stuff that was inboard, and would probably have continued all the way down. Our solar system is unusual in having a really big Jupiter-sized planet. Gas giants are more your Uranus-Neptune size, and so the humongous jumbo-sized ones. Fascinating analysis, yes. Unusualness, of course, the anthropic people can play up this aspect as well. The fact that it's an unusual feature of the solar systems to have such a massive super gas giant in play. And if it hadn't been for Saturn forming farther out to kind of slow things down, Jupiter would probably have swung in and become very typical of these monstrous Jovian-style planets that orbit quite close to stars, which can theoretically have life-bearing things. That's why a lot of the cosmologists are fascinated to look into the issue, the idea of whether or not something that's from a smaller, dimmer star with a big gas giant revolving around it and moons around it. But then it all again depends on what kind of magnetic fields are involved, because Jupiter's magnetic fields trap radiation particles on a devastating scale. And so there's an awful lot that's going on in there. Anyway, the sheer repetition of a lot of the mantras about the comets being young, and there's things about the latest material on Pluto and others. That's another bit with, I think, Triton, the moon of Saturn, was apparently formed farther out and then got pulled in and bounced around and eventually fell into place. I think it's even a retrograde orbit around Saturn, which suggests it's got a much more interesting history. And a lot of these things are taking place after the formation of the solar system. So that means that they're not as young as, or not as old as, the whole solar system itself, which then creationists can pounce in and try to argue, well, that should mean that everything's only 6,000 years old. Yeah, that's not going to work out terribly well. So anyway, there's an awful lot of new material that we'll be putting in on that front. Jackson's just finished up reading my additions to the big chapter on fossil material, particularly the Precambrian-Cambrian period, and there's also stuff on the origin of mammal, the tetrapods with Tiktaalik and all the rest. And there's some new material that has popped in that we'll be plugging in addition to this new paper that just came out regarding diversity during the Boring Billion, and the phylogenies that are gradually sorting out more and more about what's going on with these ancient organisms. The quibbly diff on all of that has to do with the fact that so many of the very early forms that we see in the Cambrian and Precambrian don't have living representatives for us to look at, including the dominant critters that were popping around in the Cambrian, the trilobites, which died out, I think, at the end of the Permian. And so we have 0 living examples of those. Had we had surviving trilobites, even just a few little species knocking around, then you'd be able to do genotyping, and then you'd be able to look at all the internal mechanisms of stuff, and that would sort out their relationships with the other arthropods and all that in a much greater bit. Okay, we're going to turn off a notification suggestion. And so the science field is just burgeoning along, but ironically, the most detailed harumphing going on in the Cambrian that we're going to be discussing in the new book is not from the Young Earth Creationist camp, but it's from Gunter Beckley over at Evolution News. And Jackson was gobsmacked by a lot of the material that he had done already, and then I've added on additional material to dive into more and more of what's going on with that little fellow. He'll be popping up again in the Human Evolution chapter, because Beckley has kind of tread the same path that Casey Luskin and others have done on trying to minimize human evolution without ever telling us what the hell they think happened with anything. And that's another field where the technical literature is constantly expanding at a rate way bigger than the typical creationist can deal with it. And then there's kind of a little sidebar. Beckley pops up in the thing that hasn't happened yet, which is that stupid paper on whale evolution, where they were supposedly disproving that. And it's been now, 5 years or more since he was rumored that it was ready to be done. Haven't heard hide nor hair of it. It hasn't popped up at Complexity. It hasn't been put, as far as I can tell, in any of the pay-for-play journals that a lot of the intelligent designers and creationists publish in. So whatever happened to that, we don't know. My understanding was that he was going to send the preprint of it to Gutsick Gibbon to look over, because they were discussing it in one of their videos back in 2019, I think. But as far as I know, that hasn't happened yet. If anybody knows any different, please let me know. We'll want to deal with all of that. So we want to keep up to date on all the little fun and games with the anti-evolution bid in all of their grandiose glory. Whereas Volume 1 was an awful lot of technical material. It was touched on aspects of geology and aspects of radiometric dating and the like. Here we're going to be having a lot on the historical material, because we're going to be discussing in greater detail that whole flood mythology stuff. First, from the angle of how it completely screws up on the data floor level for the history of human species and culture, which therefore bounces back on the human evolution angle that goes farther back. But also with a just severe misrepresentation of how people do legends, and how people have recorded elements of the physical world in their legendary accounts. We'll be talking about all of the searches for Noah's Ark. That's the continual just comic opera dumb stuff of how silly some of this stuff can get. And just as we had a section in the first book on the confusion among creationists as to which hominin are humans and which ones are apes, you get the same kind of problems with a lot of these supposed dinosaur sightings and pictographs and the like, as to whether or not the creationist says, yeah, this is kind of claptrap, or they're taking it seriously. So there's a gradation that you find between ICR and AIG and CMI. We'll be having, it's about half a dozen litmus test items to see how they disagree about what's going on this matter. So it's a comic opera of grasping at straws and misrepresentation of primary sources and bold assertions of undocumented material. And it's going to involve things like Sodom and Gomorrah, and there'll be little jabs along the way with Graham Hancock and that crowd. And there's just a lot of stuff that's all going on in there. So anyway, it's going to be a fun time to see what's going on. Let us remind everyone of our patrons. who have been very, very helpful in all of these times. And I'm well aware of the fact that in the coming murky Trump 2.0, that people may not be able to support the project in the way they could before. Or maybe for those who have a good income stream, they may be emboldened to support the project to keep us going. So at any rate, anybody involved in this, do not put forward a dime unless you can afford to do it, because there's going to be way too many potential problems going on in here. I will remind everybody that one of the things that I'm doing in the course of the research beyond the works in that we're writing is measuring at source level just what primary source material, technical literature, has been cited and dealt with by anti-evolutionists. And that means that we're measuring in no uncertain terms just how much of the regular science field anti-evolutionists are missing. And the numbers are remaining pretty constant. They're avoiding about 90% of it. When you look at books like Titans and the previous ones that we've analyzed, the Jensen books and others, they're all running in a relatively small number of technical papers that are alluded to in the course of a whole book-length thing. And of that, they're misrepresenting about 50% or more of those works. That was true of Jensen, and it's going on true of this. And therefore, when any creationist, and Casey Luskin takes the same position, say, we deal with the same data, only with a different worldview. No, you don't deal with the same data. Deal with a little tiny little slice of data, and the big picture you're not accounting for. And until you can account for that big picture, nobody is obliged to pay the slightest attention to you, because all you're doing is cherry picking little bliplets and failing to work out a model for any of it. So that's the ongoing project angle of it. Thanks everybody who has been able to help out on the project. And as I said, I'm not very optimistic about where the economy is going to be going over the next few years. I give Trump 2.0 about a year before a lot of shit starts hitting an awful lot of fans. Some of the stuff may be hitting even earlier. There's already queasiness. This Dow Jones went down 1,000 points. It gained back 400 or so of it before the weekend. But still, that I think is going to be small potatoes if we actually hit the inflationary trade hobbling speed bumps that Trump wants to do. And there was a long tweet he put out where he's dangling the prospect that he wants to buy Greenland still. It was a long tweet, and it was grammatically fairly well structured, which suggests he wasn't the one typing it. We know that Trump will often just dictate and ramble, and then some little elf will be typing the actual texts in for the tweet sending. It's a weird problem, because we've actually seen videos of that aspect fairly recently. So I assume that that's continuing with the case. So anyway, we've got a good half hour on here. Thanks for sticking with Night Owl Barbara. And let me put up our Rocks Were There book advert. There we go, and get that out of the way. As usual, I definitely would like to thank dear Peter for having done, he works with Aaron Ra and Jackson and others for running their shows, and did all this at free gratis, the adverts for the opening bit as well as the book. And we will presumably have one out as well for Rocks Were There Volume 2, which, cross fingers, we will want to have out in 2025. I will also be hopefully finishing up Paralogs number 3, Jewels to the Flame, which about a third of the way through at the moment. Part of my brain is in 1876 Baltimore. So we slide back and forth from the science world that we do with our project here and our fantastical, wonderful adventure stories with the fogs. I enjoy doing both of them. Keeps my little brain running. And I hope people get good entertainment out of it all. I would be pointing to the Paralog's books up on the upper shelf if I were home in Spokane. So anyway, everybody stay safe, gird down once we get past Trump's inaugural. Avoid listening to a lot of his speeches. Just listen to news coverage of them, because otherwise you'll be dyspeptic. And hunker down financially, to play it very close to the chest, because I am anticipating 2025 to be like 1929, and 2026 to be an awful lot like 1930. And how much of that will also have terrible problems with international activities will be another matter that we will see. All depends on who gets in the Trump administration, whether Kash Patel and other people are put in at the administrative level. There are a lot of really nutballs going on there. It's, I think, from my understanding of the history of things, I've never seen a lineup of cabinet appointees and administrative appointees as unqualified and crazy trained as Trump 2.0. So it's going to be bumpy. We have a different dynamic politically in the bigger picture. There's a European Union that wasn't the case back in 1920s and 30s. And so there's a different set of variables, but we're going to have a lot of people ignore the advice of the President of the United States and his various minions for the next 4 years, and try to pick up the pieces. And there's going to be a lot of pieces to pick up. So anyway, everybody hunker down, stay careful, have a wonderful Christmas. We'll see you all next week, and then we'll be bumping in through New Year's and into next time night. By the episode after that, I should be back in Spokane with all of the fun and games. So everybody, stay safe. Watch out for the wooden penguins, especially if they're wearing Trump hats. And we will see you next week.